George Khalife, how are you, man?
What's going on, Ben? It's good to reconnect, dude. Well, first of all, congrats to you on making the transition. Is this the first video after the
Yeah,
big
yeah.
announcement? Yeah.
This is the first one. I just thank you. Yeah, I didn't even think about that. That's funny. Yeah, this is the official first video that I'm doing as the founder of Orion 3 and nothing else. So yeah, timing worked out perfect.
There you go. I got to give the shout out to you first, then. Thanks for
Thank you.
having me on, man.
I appreciate that. No, I really appreciate that. And I mean, even just all the how supportive you've been and the ideas that you've given, I really, really appreciate that. So
My pleasure.
um and like I wanted to have you on this because one, you have your own podcast, which I think is awesome, which is cool, which has been picking up a lot of steam. Two, you're the only one that I actually had on here that literally moved from a different country to the US a month before the pandemic.
Okay.
So there's definitely stuff that I want you to talk about there. But first off, just go off with, tell me a little bit about yourself and your background and all that.
Sure. And thanks again for having me on, man. I appreciate it. So I guess I can start with the personal side. I dislike when someone starts just with their title. So just to give some context for people who may not know me at all, I grew up in Lebanon. Lived half of my life in the Middle East across different countries like Saudi Arabia, Bahrain. It's funny now in my line of work, investment banks often talk about doing roadshows for companies as they look to go public. I joke and often say like I did the immigrant roadshow, which I think a lot of people who maybe had a similar path would resonate with. So, went to different schools, different countries, eventually immigrated with my family, luckily enough, to Canada. So we started out in Ottawa, moved eventually
When did you get to Canada?
in about '03.
So how old were you at that time? Asking your age now, buddy.
Yeah, no, it's all good. At the time I was around in grade five, grade six.
Okay. Okay. So like
Yeah,
what, 11, 12 years old?
11, I wouldn't say 11, 12, roughly around there.
Okay, cool.
So,
So you
yeah,
get
so we started,
to,
what's that?
so you get to Canada in '03.
Get to Canada in '03. And big kudos to my parents for that, man. Huge risk at the time. They didn't know anybody, and we literally left everything that we had back home to do that process, essentially to give my sister and I a chance at a better future, a better education, and essentially a lot of the reasons of why folks do this in the first place. So we went to Ottawa. Eventually, I moved to Toronto for work, where I started my career with the Toronto Stock Exchange. I've kind of worn different hats so far in my career. I've seen it from the kind of public market side, so with TSX on the IPO side. I worked with a boutique M&A firm, so doing mergers and acquisitions, just for tech companies essentially, so tech exits and building out the business development function. And then I joined this really cool growth startup out of Vancouver. It's a fintech company called Owl.co, whose co-founders are really good friends of mine. So I also got to see it from the company side, which often is, I would say, a bit of a harder place to sit, a harder seat to sit in. And after doing that for a couple months, life kind of by whim took me here to Chicago for two reasons. One, kind of a personal reason, just got engaged. So my fiance lives and studies here, and helping the TSX currently open and grow their office across the Midwest.
Got it. So you moved here at the perfect time, a month before a global pandemic. I remember when,
100%.
because I think it was Ben Kelly that introduced us, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, and I remember we can even really meet up for coffee or we can really meet up or go out for drinks or anything like that because everything was closed. So tell me a little bit about the Toronto Stock Exchange.
Sure. And shout out to Ben for that, man. It's definitely an intro I appreciate a lot. So what's funny, because I literally moved, we were talking before we started recording, I literally moved here January of 2020, right? So I had 2 months of essentially trying to map out the city a bit better, get a better feel, get acclimated, try to meet people in person, which, in winter has this different sets of issues. But yeah, basically I had two months in market, like in person. So ever since then, everything's been virtual for a lot of folks. So it's been exciting. Before I get to the SX side, just one last kind of joke on this, but everybody kept telling me, dude, you're going to miss out on the best part of being in Chicago, which is the summer, right? Like you live in the Gold Coast. I mean, you're next to the lake. This is the time to be in Chicago. And I'm like, it's all good, man, because I set the bar so low that by the time things reopen, it's only going to be up from here, right? So I'm excited to be here regardless. But essentially, for those who don't know or may not have come across it, the Toronto Stock Exchange is essentially a marketplace that gives companies at different stages a venue for growth, whether that means raising capital or public capital, an avenue to use their shares as a currency to make acquisitions, which is why you often see public companies do that. It could be for exposure and profile, especially in subsectors like that are not in SaaS, right? That make every headline on like TechCrunch or every other tech media platform. So think like mining, hardware, med devices, right? The non maybe sexy subsectors that aren't often talked about. And then liquidity for investors. That's really what it is. So TSX is comparable to the major US exchanges you have here in the US, right? NASDAQ and NYSE. We're actually third in the world when it comes to the global pools or global markets for capital. The other just last difference is that in Canada, we actually have another platform like TSX Venture, which is a junior marketplace. So it uses the same technology as TSX. It's just meant for earlier stage companies that raise a little bit of a smaller round of financing. So essentially, it's a platform for growth.
So I guess like what's your mission? What's your goal here in Chicago? And you're basically you started this from scratch in Chicago, right? So I want you to talk a little bit about that, but starting off with like what your goals are here.
Yeah, it's a really good question, and I think I mean, having known me now for close to a year, virtually and non-virtually, I'm very value-oriented, very long-term oriented, right? It's both in my DNA as a Middle Easterner, but also just in my approach in my profession, dude. The way I think of it is in two folds. The first thing is a culture, right? Chicago and the Midwest and the Great Lakes area are very similar to the way Canadians are. We don't like folks who are kind of what I call flyover, right? You come in for a year, do a couple of things, and then peace out, when things look rosy. We're really committed to the US and we see a product market fit. What we're trying to essentially do in a nutshell is help US companies raise public capital in Canada through either TSX or TSX Venture if it's right for the company. If you think of a context of like a really quality US company, they're going to have multiple routes that they can go to, right? VC being one of them, private equity, venture debt, crowdfunding more recently. There's a few other avenues. We just want to be on the menu of financing options for companies and say, listen, if it's for the betterment of your growth for the next 5 to 10, like if this aligns with what you want to become, let's help you quarterback that process. Let's help explain what it looks like. Let's help connect you to investment banks, legal counsel, everything you have to do so that you can see success on our markets. And the last thing I'd say, why I'm so excited to be here, man, is as you've seen, Chicago has this kind of phenomenon, especially in the Midwest, kind of like what Malcolm Gladwell says, big fish, small pond. Toronto has a sort of similar flair to it. And there's a bit of a chip on the shoulder of an entrepreneur to say, like, we can make it happen without the help of the coasts. So what I really want to do is help companies raise an alternative source of financing, see it be successful, help companies grow in the Midwest and not have to always resort to maybe one singular option. And then, see companies thrive through the means of, growing in size, more employment for the city, not just in Chicago, but across the Midwest, and start using that as a case study for other companies who at this point might not be as comfortable with what that path looks like.
So at what point, like, well, two things. One, what is the benefit for a company to be, to have you guys be one of their investors? And two, at what stage are you looking at companies? Because I know you're I mean, in 1 year, man, like, especially in a virtual world, I feel like everybody knows you. It's like, what the, like,
in large extension, because I know you, my friend.
good answer. But no, but it's actually really cool. So like, at what stage you like, I know your long-term relationships and I've already seen that from you, but when you look at a company, like at what stage is it like, okay, that's TSX right now, that's what we want to go. So can you answer both of that in one?
Yeah, certainly. It's a great question, Ben. I hope you don't mind, by the way, me calling you Ben. It's like a nickname I just came up on this podcast. So
No,
Benny,
go for
Ben.
it. That's
All right.
really, I mean, I don't know how you get Ben from Benny, but yeah, away from
It kind of makes sense. I'm super creative when it comes to nicknames. But a couple of things there. So and just maybe a slight correction, it's TSX or TSX Venture is not necessarily an investor, right? So think of us basically as like, I always use this analogy of like a shopping mall, right? We're kind of the venue. We're the venue that hosts, instead of stores, companies, and instead of us being the investor, we open the gates, basically. We make it safe for investors to partake in the performance of those companies. So think of us as that venue, right? That allows or provides the technology to make both interactions happen, connecting companies to capital, right? That's essentially the gist of it from a very, very high lens. In terms of the range, this is like the unique part of the Canadian capital markets versus the US in a very, very specific way. It's two things. It's the sizes of companies that are able to go public on our markets, and also the financings they can do. So on TSX Venture, we see companies as early as pre-revenue in certain situations. They have to have a very specific kind of technology service, a road to getting to post revenue in the next, let's say, 2 years, but we can still help them go public. often what we see is companies with at least a couple of million in revenue to start, kind of at the floor, and then they can actually look at TSX Venture. They usually do a raise of anywhere from 2 to 20 million, right? So a pretty small financing to start. These companies have market values of like 30 to 40 million. And the whole reason, I don't know if you're a sports fan, but the whole reason we have this kind of two-tiered setup, a lot of those companies, like one in particular, The Score, if you're a sports fan, it's a media company, our version of ESPN minus Stephen A. Smith. They start on the TSX Venture, end up graduating or uplisting to TSX. So they get to this market cap that allows them to basically uplist to TSX, more liquidity, more eyeballs, greater access to financing. And eventually, for a lot of the US companies in question, they can still list on a US exchange. So they're able to use us as almost a kind of a starting point or a stepping point to do a list on a major US exchange. And we've seen close to 200 companies do that. So we actually have a pretty good relationship.
You're saying a company can partner with you guys, but then eventually go IPO in the US?
So they would essentially do a list. A lot of companies, like the close to 200 companies that I was mentioning, they basically have a ticker or let's say a place in both TSX, like on our markets. So they have access to TSX investors, institution, retail, average investors like you and I, as well as in the US. So Shopify is a great example of that, right? Okay. Shopify is a company that's dual listed on TSX and on NYSE. So they basically, like, if you look at their flow, it's like if they opened the gates to both Canadian and US investors. They have that liquidity pool, which obviously has global investors as well.
Got it. Okay, that makes a lot more sense because I didn't know you could do both of them. That's why I was
yeah, it's all good. No, it's a great question, man.
So tell me a little bit about you just building this from scratch in the Midwest, and especially in the city of Chicago, and especially with the pandemic, because you've done some really good things. And I'll let you talk about it, but I think it's important to hear that story of yours and from where you started, what you did, and where you're at right now.
Yeah, sure. And I honestly, and it's not sugarcoating or because we're doing this in a recorded way. You know this, man. But I honestly lean on a lot of folks like you, like Ben, and there's way too many to mention at this point. But a lot of friends who have become friends more recently, to help build this kind of infrastructure. To start, I think the first thing that I tried to do is really try to understand as much as I could about the startup ecosystem in Chicago, who the big players are, what are the up and coming companies, the media outlets, just kind of like the lay of the land, right? If you look at the mirrors behind me, it's kind of like just piecing this together as much as possible. The second part, though, like you can read as much as you can, right, on Eno, which is a newsletter I enjoy, and a few other things like that. But you have to be on the ground, and that's why we built a market here. Like again, coming here for 3 days and then going back to Toronto isn't sufficient. I have to be on the ground, getting a feel, right, getting a vibe for what the city's like. Going to networking events, meetups, and all these avenues, like jumping into the accelerator, like 1871.
So that you were able to do for the first 2 months you were here, right?
Exactly.
And because it's one thing for us, for the people that were here before, was able to establish things before COVID happened by doing the I call it the Chicago business development activities, right? Which is not necessarily the same in the suburbs and in other states, but you only had 2 months of it. So tell me a little bit about that, like after that, like in the transition to shelter in place and how you still had to run your business.
Yeah. And listen, it's obviously difficult. I mean, in the context of things, man, there's other professions or roles that are much harder. I really just had to sit in my living room on my laptop and try to figure this out. But two things I can tell you, like from a micro perspective, that helped. One is figuring out how to be more scalable, right? Me having one-on-one conversations with companies, as much as I love to, as like an entrepreneurial DNA, is just not the most scalable for one person trying to build a market in the Midwest. So by scalability, what I mean is, through folks like you who you've been here much longer than I have, right? And figuring out where the points of comparison come from, where we have synergy, where I can give you leverage, where you might help give me leverage, and spread that. As part of that scalability, I think one of the things that most often gets overlooked is just because someone isn't in your direct industry doesn't mean they can't be valuable to your either network or what you're trying to accomplish, and vice versa, right? In fact, some of the best connections I've ever had, some of the best friends I've ever made are nothing like me, not even close to like my industry. They're like almost complete opposites.
Yeah.
The second part is, in terms of scalability, is like building that network effect, is really trying to be a value. And this word is so fluff now, dude. I'm sure you hear it all the time. And sometimes it's like said without putting thought into it. So when I say value, it's like really taking time to understand what Benny does, what his role is, what his focus areas are. And before coming into the meeting or call, having those points already mapped out. So what I started doing was switching the conversation of TSX being just a source to go public. And what I often say now is a conduit for capital. When we're going to have an intro or a conversation with a startup, think of me as that another source for intros for capital, whether it's VCs that I'm meeting in the Midwest or in Canada, private equity, as I said. And if public option makes sense, perfect. I'll QB that as well. So that was a big one. And then the last thing is just partnerships, right? I really tried to embed ourselves in the ecosystem, dude. That was super important to me. So we were sponsors with Chicago Next. They just launched their Startup Chicago portal, highlighting Chicago startups to national investors. We just signed a partnership with Midwest Connect with Jonathan out of Sandolphin. So super excited about these partnerships. And aside from just putting kind of a money kind of tied to it, we really want to go deeper, right? It's us actually being a part of the community at all stages of companies.
Got it. No, and kudos to you on what you did, and you've already started making a name for yourself within the tech space, and like your podcast is awesome. Like you're just doing a lot of really cool things right now, and a lot of us had to adapt, and we can't change COVID, so we can only adapt, and you've done a really nice job of it. And I'm looking forward to some of the things that I know I'm going to hear some big news coming up from you soon. So I really appreciate you being on here, man, and thank you so much.
Thanks, buddy. I appreciate you, man. Good luck on you taking the step to doing this on your own as well. We're all here to support you, dude. So keep at it.
Thank you, brother. I really appreciate that.